Hi there, folks. I think people are slowly joining. That's awesome. I do want to thank everybody for being so patient. I'm really sorry there was a technical issue as we were beginning the session today. So I'm really glad to see so many people are still here. Again, thanks for being so patient. We'll extend the time a little bit in the other direction. So, oh, and I'm seeing some faces too. Hello, that's wonderful. Um, Great. So, some of you, I imagine, are recognizing my space from before. I'm Lauren Spring, and I'm an art educator with the Art Gallery of Ontario. And this is one of our very special senior social events. So, in pre-pandemic world, we would have been in the AGO together, walking through the gallery, looking at a piece or two, and then heading down to the studio to make our own art. Today, we're all doing that from our homes. And I've selected two works of art to share with you today that are both sculptures, both made out of everyday objects, and both by contemporary artists that I have a feeling you'll find quite compelling. So I'm very eager to hear what your thoughts are. For those who've not joined one of these senior social sessions before, it is very interactive. I'm going to pitch out questions to the group. I'd love to hear about your reactions to these works. And if you're comfortable doing so, you can unmute yourself and share your thoughts with your voice. Video on too if you'd like to. If not, then you're welcome to type into the chat as well to share some of your ideas. You should see that little icon there that you can participate that way too. This session is being recorded for, it'll live on our website for folks who aren't able to join today. So just so you're aware of that for those of you who would like your video on or off. Great, and let's get started without further ado. So here is the Art Gallery of Ontario, located in downtown Toronto on Dundas Street. Really spectacular building, designed by world famous architect Frank Gehry. And the doors are open again now. If you're interested in visiting in person, we'd love to have you. We have a whole bunch of really special exhibitions on right now, and Picasso that has just recently opened. So do check out the website for more details about that. It focuses on Picasso's Blue Period. We also have an exhibition called Fragments of Epic Memory. Also Matthew Wong, who's also sort of in the blue theme of work. So some really great temporary exhibitions to see. And then our permanent collection, which I know I have missed a great deal while the doors were closed. And I'm just so happy to be able to stand beside these works again. So we are open if you are close to the Toronto area and eager to walk through the space again. I'll also take a moment to acknowledge that the land the AGO is on is Mississauga territory, Mississauga. It is also governed by a treaty between the Mississauga of the Credit and the Canadian government. Toronto is Mississauga territory. It has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat confederacies. I also want to say a big thank you to Amica Senior Lifestyles, our lead sponsor for the Senior Social, for generously supporting this program. It's thanks to them that we're able to be here and meet in this virtual space. Okay, so here is the first work of art that I've selected to share with you today. It's a piece by an artist named Willie Cole, as you can see. And before I share with you some of the things that I find most compelling about this work, I'd like to hear from you again. You can unmute yourself and respond with your voice, or you can type into the chat. But I'd really like to hear from you kind of your immediate reactions, what you notice going on here, maybe questions that come to mind when you look at this piece. Anything at all. Okay, so one question, yeah, how are they stuck together? You can see how, check that out. So yeah, they're kind of everyday objects. Folks can probably see what this is made out of. You can even read about it in the side. So it's shoes, leather, plastic, rubber, metal. So yeah, we've got lots of different shoes, and so you might wonder, okay, how are they actually kind of sticking together to make this particular form?
Yeah, I love this. I love this piece. I go visit it every time I go to the AGO. There's a section on the, I think it's the second floor, where all these recycled materials are, and I think that they are absolutely brilliant. But at first glance, when I looked at this, I didn't recognize it because it looked like it was African. And I thought, wow, this is like a totem piece. So it's very interesting to me to see it's like the mother, labeled the mother and child, but I don't see the child. And usually in the mother, like Madonna's, the child is always, Jesus is always prominent, but I don't see him. So unless I find it fascinating.
Well, that's great. So you said so many interesting things there. Yeah, I think on the one hand, when this work is on display, it is typically right outside of our African galleries. And that's for a good reason, because Willie Cole finds a lot of inspiration. He's a contemporary artist living and working today, but he finds a lot of inspiration from African art. And at the AGO, we have a very large African art collection, primarily from the west coast of Africa. And so that's sort of why this work is kind of partnered in that gallery. And I think Willie Cole would be happy to hear you say that you confused it for a more traditional African art piece, because he certainly is taking a lot of cues from the way museums display African sculpture and his own kind of African American heritage as well. So there's a lot there. And then in terms of the child, does anyone see? I'm going to show you, I have another angle of this work too. I feel like I hear a voice in the distance there. From my reading of the work, I think that this might be the child here, sort of being carried on the back. You can imagine maybe the heel of this shoe, sort of the child's arm maybe reaching around, or some kind of, cloth carrier of some sort, as we know many mothers do. I have a 3-year-old now, but when she was little, sort of the only way to do anything was to have her in the carrier. And so in my reading, this is probably the child here at the back, but I'd be curious if anyone sees it differently.
Well, I think that's brilliant that it is at the back, like you said, that now I see it, because in Africa, children are carried on the back. They're not like some babies are carried in the front. I don't know what you call it, where they're facing out, like there's all kinds of carrying things. But in the back, it's traditionally like, I'll call it a papoose. I don't know what other word to use. But I just find it really interesting from the the Christian tradition of the child being always nurtured on the front by the mother's breast. And this is really great.
Yeah, and I think that's, and I have a feeling when he labeled this work mother and child, it was meant to be provocative in that way. Because certainly, especially walking through, galleries and museums, oftentimes if folks hear that title, they'll associate it with the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. There's so many paintings and depictions of that sort of mother-child relationship. And you're right, if we sort of look more internationally, there's lots of different ways of caring for children, right? And certainly we know a lot of mothers, various countries in Africa, spend their days working, just, a couple of weeks, months postpartum. They have a lot of work to do for survival. And so, yeah, being able to carry the child and bring them along with you and teach them in certain ways is quite key. And so one of the other really interesting things about this is the material that Willie Cole has decided to use here. So if you look carefully, you'll see that they're black shoes, and they're a particular kind of black shoe, which we'll talk more about momentarily. But they're also all in their entirety. In some cases, they're sort of folded, like what seems to be the child's head here is the sole of the shoe that's folded over. But he hasn't sort of disassembled and then reassembled these shoes. He's just kind of kept them as they were in their shoe form, and then found really creative ways to melt them together, as someone else said in the comments here. This idea of like they do seem kind of melted into each other. And so I'm curious to hear from folks, when you think of, and some of you might have experience wearing black high-heeled shoes, what do you associate with them? And it could be anything. It could be a word that you associate with black high heels. It could be a feeling. It could be, something related to sort of social status or anything at all. Elegance. That's one thing for sure. What else might you associate with black high-heeled shoes? Yeah, going out. So yeah, it could be sort of some sort of, yeah, night out, a festive occasion, something that you're getting dressed up for. Certainly. So other words related to those might be, fun. Julianne here is saying a need for balance. Yeah, those of us who've had experience wearing, especially some of these, right? Some of these are really kind of tiny heels, so difficult to balance. Yeah, sometimes funeral, if we're thinking black shoes specifically. I do not do well with high heels. I've, had to wear them for various jobs here and there too. So kind of, I would associate with them with, professionalism or sometimes professional dress codes. For those identified as sort of female women on staff. But yeah, I have often suffered, so I associate with them with a lot of pain, which is, quite interesting because at the one time we might think pleasure and party, but on the other hand, there's this sort of really painful side to it, or if you're kind of forced to wear them at work. I know I have lots of friends who still work in sort of restaurant industries and are often, yeah, they have to wear these and they're on their feet all evening. Yeah, and someone else here is noting that the shoes here seem quite nice and polished. They're not too scuffed up, which is quite interesting because Willie Cole, one of the things that he really likes to do is he works a lot with shoes. So this is not the only sculpture that he's ever made with shoes. And he always buys them secondhand. It might be sort of related to the picture here, because if we see it from the other angle, you can see there are some scuffs. And if you were to see it in person, you'd notice that, yeah, they are actually worn. Like they're very clearly worn. Still nice and, still could probably be purchased and worn from a secondhand shop. But that's one of the things is that he really likes to use shoes that have already been worn before. He does, when he works with found objects, he often thinks of them not only aesthetically, kind of, creating this sculpture wasn't just, okay, I could put these two shoes here and they make this interesting lip for the mouth, but also kind of what they represent. And I think that's the case with a lot of contemporary artists who use found objects or, kind of objects from everyday popular culture, is that the objects themselves have a meaning beyond just, oh, this would be a neat one to put together with this. There's often something kind of invested in the object itself. And one of the things that he says that he really likes about shoes is that we talk often about the sole of a shoe. And obviously, the spelling is different, S-O-L-E for the sole, the actual piece of the shoe that you step on. But he's been really fascinated by shoes because he thinks that they're, we often use expressions like, walk a mile in their shoes. The shoes kind of tell us a lot about a person and they accompany us on really interesting places that we go in our lives. He was first inspired to use shoes because he had at the time, his son was 12, and apparently had been, his son was quite sporty and had a bunch of these old running shoes that he couldn't wear anymore. They were sort of too worn out, but he was really attached to it. He had this big bag of these shoes that he thought, I can't really just discard them because this one I wore in this particular competition and this one has a scuff from this moment that I tripped and fell during this soccer game, that kind of thing. And so in many cases, our shoes really do reflect places we've been to and things that we've lived. If you look at the soles of my shoes, on one foot, I kind of balance a little bit differently and parts of it, the big toe get worn out more easily than the other side. And so they do sort of mark a little bit about us and our personality and our way of living in the world. And I think, in this kind of symbolic realm can be linked to the S-O-U-L, our own souls and our own individual beings. And so I think that's one of the things that compelled Willie Cole to work with this material. And so, yeah, he started going to thrift shops and people, when they started seeing this kind of art that he was creating, people started donating a lot of their own shoes to him too. And so he uses primarily used shoes. We have a comment here too. So the face seems really apparent from this perspective, almost like the soles make large insect-sized proportions of eyes. I like that a lot. Yeah, there is certainly something very kind of animalistic about this creature being depicted here. Certainly, yeah, and I can see this kind of insect reference for sure. And it's really quite skillful when you look aesthetically. Like it must have been such a creative endeavor to have these big piles of shoes and then figure out exactly how they match together. I especially like the knees here. You can see one shoe here with the big chunky heel matches up with one underneath, and the heels sort of touch. So yeah, really quite creative work. He also, one of the things that first inspired Willie Cole to work with found objects is that he was walking home. He lives in New Jersey, and he was walking home one day and approaching his apartment, and he kind of saw on the ground an iron that someone had discarded. Anyone who's been to, downtown New York, New Jersey, you often find really creative, interesting things sort of scattered around the streets. And so he sort of passed by it, went to go up to his apartment, and then just something drew him back. And so he picked it up, and you can imagine, yeah, just the sort of iron that you would iron your clothes with. And he said, I'm going to take this into my studio because it's speaking to me in some particular way. And then the more longer he sat with it, the more he started to relate it to African history, essentially, and in his own familial history, African American history, and the slave trade, because he likened that sort of scorching hot iron to slaves who had been branded during their capture, and also the shape of it. So he ended up using that iron and then others to sort of do prints with, because it's the shape almost like of a ship. And so he likened it to slave ships. And so did a series of artworks that were prints, where actually irons kind of dipped into ink and printed on the page. And so a lot of, like these shoes, those irons too hold a lot of meaning. We have another comment here. So at first it sort of seems slapped together, but the more you look at it, the more you can see how skillfully it's assembled. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another reason why these are so great to see in person, because obviously you can just walk around yourself. I do have one more angle here. You can see the back and the baby kind of seated here from a different angle. And so, yeah, obviously 3D object in the gallery, they're always displayed in a way that you can walk right around them. And so the second piece that I've decided to share with you today is also made out of shoes, also by a contemporary artist, also sort of unpacking the meaning behind the shoes that are the primary kind of material being used. And also sort of, just like Willie Cole was inspired by African sculpture that he had seen in a lot of museums like the Met in New York City, and for better or worse, on the one case, really admiring the craftsmanship, but then also sort of thinking, wait a second, these are pretty sacred objects. And in many cases in museums like the Met, even with our own AGO African art collection, we don't know necessarily the names of the artists who made them or whether they would want them to be in a gallery like this. In many cases, they were made for sacred ceremonies, or to be, in the case of ancestral sculptures, often to be sort of at the front of someone's house. So now that they're in a museum, we're not, there's a lot of sort of ethical questions there. And this next artist too, Bryan Jungen, works through many of these same themes. So here's an example of a piece that he made. And again, let's just open the conversation by asking what you see here. How might this differ from Willie Cole's? What kind of shoes are these? Perhaps some of you recognize these. Does it look like clearly it's been sort of assembled in a particular way? Oh, Yana here is saying it looks like the Scream. Yeah, if anyone can think of the Edvard Munch with and a very expressive scream there. I can see that certainly. Yeah, the mouth wide open here. I'm going to show you another angle as well. So yeah, if you were imagined to, just picture yourself sort of walking through a museum and then coming upon these, what other words or associations might come to mind?
When I first when I first looked at it, it reminded me of like a Star Wars kind of creature. It looked evil in a way, and similar to masks. But on this angle, it looks like an animal. So I don't know. To me, it's very animistic.
Very nice. Yeah, very animistic. That's a great word. I can see the Star Wars connection here too. I don't know, sadly, all of the different characters, but I go to say, yeah, some sort of stormtrooper type mask. And then, yeah, also could be sort of animalistic from certain angles. Others are saying in the chat, yeah, looks like maybe a skull or something primal or a dinosaur skull of some sort. Lovely. And I think I have one more angle here. Yeah, this is what it looks like at the back. And so you can see they are Nike Air Jordans. Someone else had said that in the chat too. So you can see, yeah, the official kind of stamp, they are Nike Air Jordans. And unlike Willie Cole, when Bryan Jungen works with shoes, he actually tears them apart. So we can see really clearly at the back here. He does rip them apart and then sews them back together to form a totally different shape and figure. And so in this particular case, folks might be familiar with Bryan Jungen. We had a really big show of his. Geez, I don't even know what time is anymore, but definitely pre-pandemic, probably summer, I'd say summer 2019, most likely. And we had a huge show of Bryan Jungen, so some of you might have seen his work there. But he really is a fascinating artist. He is of indigenous ancestry, so his father, I believe, his father was Swiss, and he was raised in part by his Swiss family because his parents very sadly died in a house fire when he was 7. But his mother was Daneza, and so he grew up, you know, knowing this part of his heritage, but not immediately connected to his mother's family. And so as he started to get older after high school, him and his siblings were sent back to their Daneza community, and he started to learn and realize how disconnected he was and was really fascinating and wanting to know more. And then also at the same time was deciding to pursue art and really wanted to be an artist. And so he started to kind of get to know his own culture much better and work with some of these themes. Oh, and Wendy here is saying there's also allusions to West Coast Indigenous art. Yeah, totally. And so I'm really glad you said that, because this, you can see this work is called Prototype for New Understanding. And this series of Nike Air Jordans turned into what, yeah, are supposed to be sort of Northwest Coast masks, or resemble what you might see in a museum of Indigenous masks from the Northwest Coast. This is the series that he made that launched him into the art world, and people started to really pay attention to who he was and what he was doing and what this all represented. And this particular series was quite neat. For him, Nike Air Jordans at the time, he made these throughout the 1990s, and Nike Air Jordans were sort of this popular fetish item. Like a lot of, you know, even young men primarily who couldn't really afford them would save up a lot of money so that they could buy their own pair. They were a real sort of status symbol on the basketball court and in society in general. And so they were a charged object in popular culture in the 90s. And he, you know, so much so that they were quite valued. And in terms of, yeah, if you saw someone, a friend of yours wearing them, you knew that they would have paid a lot of money. People saved up for them. So this kind of, yeah, really valuable commodity. At the same time, Bryan Jungen was spending a lot of time in museums and looking at ways that Indigenous art was displayed in galleries. And the sort of value that it was given, even though folks didn't necessarily know the artist who made them or didn't necessarily do proper research in terms of whether a particular object should be in a museum or not. They were sort of put up on this pedestal and given this sort of increased value because they were now in these museum spaces instead of within the communities. So he was working with these themes of value and popular culture and sort of trends. And so started ripping them apart and putting them back together. And this really did catapult him into the art world. And he became known as this sort of, you know, up and coming, really exciting contemporary Indigenous artist. And at the time he was studying, he was at Emily Carr Art School. And he was a little bit uncomfortable about this because he had been rather disconnected from his Daneza community growing up. And so this launched him into a real sort of research and lifestyle endeavor, where he worked with a lot of Indigenous artists and drum makers and elders to learn a lot more, so he could be a little bit more comfortable representing, Indigenous culture and ideas on this art stage. And he's done a variety of works using found objects that are just totally remarkable. They often have a bit of a playful element to them. I'm curious, did anybody here see the exhibit, the really large Bryan Jungen show at the AGO? And if so, I'm curious if any pieces in particular really stuck in your mind.
Yes, the piece that stuck in my mind was the dinosaur made out of plastic garden chairs.
Yeah. I'm really glad you remembered that one. I love that one too. Oh, and Michelle here in the chat is saying, yeah, all of the masks. Yeah, it was a really interesting setup because these are some of the, like I mentioned, the first pieces he did, and now he's still working with masks, but they're, much more elaborate, and he's really honed in his sort of sewing skills too. And so he has some more recent masks that are, like headdresses and just enormous and lots of colors. And yeah, and the dinosaur sort of sea creature whale type structure is remarkable because it's one of those, to me, that really plays with what we expect when we enter museum spaces and this idea of value. Because if you were to enter into that room, you'd see what looks like, almost like you were at the Royal Ontario Museum or something, what looks like kind of the bones of a huge creature that extends almost the entire gallery space. And my first reaction was just awe, like, oh, wow, like, look at this huge creature. And is it a whale? Is it a dinosaur? Is this prehistoric? Like, what is this? And then the closer you get when you stand right beneath it, you realize, wait a second, these aren't bones at all. This is actually like plastic lawn furniture, like from Canadian Tire. And so your mind does this weird flip-flop, and I at least felt kind of tricked by that. Like, oh, I thought it was this really sacred, valuable thing, but it's actually, cheap lawn furniture. And then when you start to read a little bit what he said about that too, he says, at a lot of powwows in these very isolated communities, Canadian Tire is not just like a store, it's like the store. And at a lot of these powwows, like community gatherings, these plastic white lawn chairs from IKEA or from Canadian Tire, whatever hardware store, are really actually valuable because that's what people need to be able to assemble and come together in circle and in celebration and ceremony. And so it makes your mind do these sort of flip-flops back and forth of like, oh, it's valuable, it's sacred. Oh, no, it's not. It's cheap. Oh, no, it is actually. And I think he really likes to sort of play those games with us and make us question sort of what we consider valuable in museum spaces. He's also worked with golf bags. He's made, also in that show, are these really extraordinary, what look like totem poles, but out of golf bags. And so referencing, in many cases, land disputes and who has access to land. Sometimes we think of golf courses as being, sort of a nice way to get outside and this big expansive space where people can be social and enjoy a nice game with their friends. But golf courses are also quite problematic. They're also very exclusive. You often have to pay a very high membership fee to get in there. Some of them are only allowing men. And then they also, those perfectly sort of green lawns also require a lot of pesticides that then run into the rivers and pollute waterways and drinking water. And so there's a lot of layers to unpack with all of his work. And so he, again, much like Willie Cole, the objects are sort of charged with meaning and associations in popular culture. Are there other things that folks wanted to comment on? Maybe other things you've seen by Bryan Jungen or ideas or questions you have about this particular piece we're looking at?
Just on a side note, George Carlin does a fantastic monologue about golf courses. And by some of the things that you're saying, I would strongly suggest to people look it up on YouTube. You don't look at golf courses the same after listening to him, and it's from years ago. So I know that's off track, but I just thought I'd throw that in there because I love this piece. It's very clever.
That's great. Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'll totally look it up. I didn't know about that one, but certainly, yeah, also linked. I think it really came to the fore too with the ochre crisis in Quebec a few decades back, where there was traditional Mohawk territory that then the government and a development company wanted to turn into a golf course. And so there was this, it turned very violent, this standoff between police and the Mohawk folks who were protecting this land, which wasn't just their land, but actually very sacred sort of ancestral burial grounds. And so golf is sort of charged in that way too for Indigenous folks. Yeah. So we just have a few minutes left, and we won't have time to do a whole big project today, but I will launch us into an art making activity. And inspired by what we have just been talking about in terms of artists who are using found objects, kind of popular everyday things, I thought maybe together we could make some kind of sculpture out of found materials. So I've gone around my house here and picked out a few things that I thought would be interesting. Some of them sort of more quote unquote charged than others. And I'd like to hear from folks if you have any random objects at the ready. Maybe you came prepared, or maybe you're right now just glancing around, your living room thinking, could I use this or that? Does anybody have anything that they'd like to share with us? Oh, we have one. I see one camera's been turned on. Oh my! Well, this.
So I've been building furniture. I don't know if you can see, but I've had lots of sort of chrome objects and metal objects like screws and such lying around. So for today, I was sort of thinking of how these objects could combine, and especially about that Willie Cole piece, the mother and child, and just thinking about how you could get something sort of organic out of metal objects. So I thought about like those dioramas, or the idea of like a landscape, or trying to create like a nature sort of scene, but using very synthetic, or like objects that are clearly metal and steel and that sort of thing. So I've sort of been playing with the arrangement to try and see what kind of evokes more of a foresty feeling, and then what doesn't. So that's kind of what I've been tinkering on in the background here.
Oh, I really like that. I like too how you've set up those black books, it seems like, as a little backdrop. You have your sculpture kind of on a stage here already. That's fabulous. And really nice, yeah. And I mean, there's no wrong way to do this, right? I mean, the examples we looked at today certainly were sewn together. I don't expect everyone to have the skills of Willie Cole or Bryan Jungen to do that with whatever old shoes you have hanging around. But just like that one participant showed us, a sculpture can be anything too, right? He was thinking about maybe a landscape setup. If you're more interested in doing portrait, or maybe we're inspired to do some kind of animal type shape, that's really fine too. I'll show you a few things that I have here to work with. So this actually came from an old chocolate box. And when I look at it, all different angles, I think this, to me, looks almost like it could be some sort of animal. Either this is a head, and maybe these two kind of poking out as ears if I were to cut it off here, or from this particular angle, we have maybe some sort of creature with a head and a tail. So I might play around a little bit with that. I also like the texture of it. I've been thinking too, the two artists made me reflect a lot on sort of the meaning that objects hold for me. And these goggles are ones that, for me personally are quite meaningful. I am an avid swimmer, and so it was a really hard time during the pandemic when the pools were closed, because I would just look at these sad little goggles sitting on my bureau and just really miss swimming and miss moving my body in that way. And so I'm really happy now. So they're quite charged here. These also, I'm a pretty frugal person, and one of our sort of family values is frugality. And so you can see when my goggles ripped, I didn't get new ones. I just sort of tied these ones together, and they still work fine. So I might incorporate this into my sculpture in some way, thinking about what it means to me. I also have these doll shoes, which come from my daughter's Cabbage Patch, and she's a kid who's really attached to her stuffed animals and her dolls, and some of the best play that we've had together is kind of creating stories with these, what she calls human figures or her little animals. But just the other day, she decided that she doesn't like her Cabbage Patch doll anymore. And so now I'm reflecting on what do I do with it? Like, on the one hand, it's been really a special part of her childhood, and on the other, it makes me a little sad that like maybe those days are done. And at the same time, she has so many toys that I don't necessarily want to hang on to things that she's not attached to anymore or is clearly not interested in playing with. So these two have a lot of meaning invested in them for me. And then I was thinking about shoes too, with Willie Cole and Bryan Jungen. I also have, like the other participant who showed us some of their recent things in terms of building. I've been building a lot lately too, so have a lot of kind of really interesting shapes that come in these little photo hanging kits. So I think I'm going to play around with some of these too and see what comes out of that, different sizes. This already makes me think a little bit about that kind of mother and child figure we were just looking at. If I were to put the mother here and the kid sort of being carried on the back. The possibilities are really endless. I'm going to spend some time and work on this and see what comes, whether it's some sort of portrait of a living thing or more of a landscape. And yeah, so I suppose we'll leave it there today in case unless anybody else would like to share what they're starting to work on. I know it was a bit of a shorter session because of our technical glitch at the beginning, but I do trust that you can find some inspiration from what we looked at today and proceed in your own space to create whatever sculpture you might create. Anyone else, just before we wrap up, want to share some of the items that they'll be working with?
Yeah, I used to give my students, well, I'm very much into environmental things, and some of the clever things that kids had done was taken garbage bags and knit with them, put them into thin strips and knit. I used to give the kids a project, and we built, each kid had to make a tree out of newspaper. Like, newspaper doesn't exist anymore, but we did an installation. There were palm trees, Christmas trees, by either rolling up newspaper, folding newspaper. It was just done with newspaper, and we installed that in Markville Mall. I'm talking about, like, these aren't by major themes, but taking one item and focusing on it. We made a 6-foot tall atlas holding the world. It was a contest, and it was made out of, what are those juice boxes?
Yeah, I think I know the ones you're talking about.
Those square, and like the blue could be the atlas. Was we took a Pilates ball and it was covered with the plastic and reassembled, like taped, and the world was made. And then atlas, like the silver underside of the atlas, his hair was curled with the silver of the. It was really quite a fascinating project, but it's amazing what you can do when I'm just suggesting, as opposed to many items, just focusing on one item and having a lot of it and seeing what you could do.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there is kind of freedom in that restraint, right? If you, like you're saying, just with garbage bags or just with juice boxes, just, similar to what Willie Cole did with sort of just high-heeled black shoes, what can you make with that?
And there's a contest, well, not a contest, but there's a project right now. One of my friends is working on it. They're collecting garbage from the Toronto beaches, and they're to use the garbage in some way to make sculptures. And she's collecting cigarette butts. And actually, people did the collecting, and then she's making a bathing suit, and it's with cigarette butts, and it's really fascinating, the singularity of objects that you can do. And the other thing, I'll just throw that out, I forget his name, but he was in a lot of craft shows. Must have been 20 years ago. He made clocks. I don't know if you remember this guy. I took a course with him once. He brought all kinds of junk, like cutlery and things, and glued it all together and spray painted it all a solid color and made clocks, like got clock faces, and the bases were all like garbage, like plastic and broken toys. And I've got a whole bag full of all this stuff that I thought, well, one day I'm going to do something with it. So I
Wow.
just wanted to throw that out there.
And maybe today's that day. Maybe.
Yeah, you've inspired me. I know, just before you go, I want to thank you. This has been great. And do you have past senior meetings, like on a website that you can look into?
That's a great question, actually. I wonder if one of my colleagues might, I don't know the answer to that one, but perhaps.
We do, yes, they're online.
Oh, and where do you go look?
I don't know. Let me post the URL in the chat, actually. I'll leave it there, then you can click on it.
Okay, thank you so much, because it's fascinating how much out of 2 pieces of art that you've uncovered, and I love that. So thank you.
My pleasure. And yeah, and we'll be here every month. So, and every single month we look at a different work of art and do a different art activity. Today's is a bit shorter than usual, but yeah, tune in again, because there's always something new. So thank you, everybody. I wonder if perhaps my colleague can also send a link to the survey, because these are ongoing. We'd love to hear what you think, sort of what worked well for you today, any areas that you'd like to explore in future. So yeah, if my colleague there could post a link to the actual survey too, you'll be able to fill that in if you feel so inclined and influence future sessions. There it is. You can see the little Survey Monkey link. So if you click on it now before the Zoom meeting ends, you'll be able to fill that in. So thank you so much, everybody. Thanks again for your patience at the start. Sorry about that technical glitch. And yeah, it was a real pleasure meeting with you here today. And we'll see you next time. Bye.